Hello everyone, I'm very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
The smell of overcooked roast beef hung heavy in the air, mixing with the bitter sting of forced smiles and unsaid things, turning my parents' cramped dining room into a pressure cooker of old grudges and newer ones we hadn't even named yet. My mom, Linda, was bustling around the table like everything was perfect, chirping out meaningless questions about the weather and the local sports teams, trying to keep the conversation afloat like a dying fish gasping for air. My dad, Tom, sat at the head of the table, chewing slowly, his silence screaming louder than anything else, his eyes darting from me to Ethan like he was watching a bomb he couldn't figure out how to defuse. Ethan, my golden boy of a brother, was in rare form tonight, leaned back in his chair like he owned the place, flashing that same smug grin he wore when he beat me in backyard baseball 25 years ago and never once let me forget it. His wife, Kelly, sat next to him, nodding and laughing at all the right moments, her diamond wedding ring flashing under the dull kitchen light, as if she needed the extra sparkle to make sure we all remembered she was a winner too. I sat there, twirling my fork against my plate, barely tasting the food, because I knew exactly where this dinner was headed. It was always the same damn thing, Ethan holding court, me playing the part of the audience, our parents refereeing badly from the sidelines, pretending not to notice how tilted the field had always been. It was as predictable as the way my dad would later unbutton his jeans after dessert and fall asleep in his recliner with a half-finished beer sweating beside him. Ethan was halfway through some boring story about his promotion, tossing out numbers and titles like poker chips, when he paused just long enough to glance over at me with a glint in his eye that I knew too well. It was the look he gave right before he kicked over your sandcastle or told your crush you picked your nose in third grade. It was the look of a man who couldn't resist one more kick while you were already down. "At least I don't work a dead-end job," Ethan said, chuckling like it was a private joke between him and the universe, stabbing a piece of roast beef so hard his fork squealed against the plate. For a second, nobody said anything. The table vibrated with the tension, like a power line about to snap. My mom gave a tight little laugh and said, "Now, Ethan, be nice," but she was already moving on, as if smoothing over a comment like that was as easy as wiping up spilled gravy. I smiled. I didn't say a word. Instead, I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out my phone, and tapped the screen a few times until the app opened up, the logo bright and shining against the cracked screen protector I still hadn't bothered to replace. I turned the phone toward Ethan, watched his face tighten just slightly before he masked it with a grin that was more teeth than warmth. "You recognize this, don't you?" I said, voice steady, casual, as if we were talking about the weather. "You use it every day at work. Your whole damn department does." Ethan squinted at the screen, then laughed, too loudly, too fake. "Yeah, everybody hates it," he said, trying to wave it off, trying to stay in control. "Good," I said, letting my smile grow just enough to sharpen the edges. "Because I built it. And I sold it to your company for $8 million last month." The silence that fell over the table was the kind that makes your ears ring, like after a bomb goes off. My dad dropped his fork with a clatter, my mom's mouth fell open mid-sentence, and even Kelly froze, her hand hovering awkwardly in the air like she had forgotten what it was supposed to be doing. Ethan's face drained of color, his jaw working up and down like he was trying to chew through a mouthful of broken glass. He opened his mouth once, then closed it again. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple, and I had to look away before I laughed, because it was just too damn good. I could have ended it there, could have let the awkwardness rot on the table like the overcooked beef, but something in me wanted more. I wanted him to feel it, really feel it, the same way I had felt every jab, every joke, every backhanded compliment for 30-something years. "You know what the best part is?" I said, leaning forward just slightly, lowering my voice so they had to strain to hear me. "HR has to notify anyone who might have a conflict of interest, and since you're a direct user of the product, guess who's getting a nice little meeting invite tomorrow morning?" Ethan swallowed hard, and for the first time in my life, I saw it, real fear. Not the kind you fake when you hear a bump in the night or when you're trying to impress your girlfriend by watching a horror movie without flinching. No, this was the kind of fear that lives deep in your gut, the kind that makes your hands shake and your mind race to places you don't want to go. My mom finally found her voice, stammering something about dessert, but nobody moved. We all sat there, frozen, locked in a moment so heavy it felt like we were all being crushed under the weight of it. And the crazy thing? I didn't feel victorious. I felt hollow, like I had finally climbed the mountain, only to find out the view sucked and the air was too thin to breathe. As the awkward small talk sputtered back to life around me, I leaned back in my chair, pretending to sip my water, pretending to listen, pretending everything was fine. But inside, my mind was a hurricane of memories and emotions, flashing back to every shitty little moment that had brought me here. I remembered the time Ethan accidentally spilled soda all over my science project the night before the fair. I remembered how he used to laugh when he beat me at everything, how my parents would just shrug and say, "Boys will be boys." I remembered every Thanksgiving dinner where I was the punchline to his jokes, every Christmas where my gifts were an afterthought compared to his pile of expensive crap. And I remembered the way it felt to sit at the kids' table year after year, even when I was 24, because in their eyes, I never really grew up. I was always the screw-up, the underachiever, the cautionary tale. But not anymore. For the first time in my life, I held the power, not just a little bit of it, not just scraps thrown my way to keep me quiet, but real, undeniable, earth-shaking power. And the best part was, I didn't have to raise my voice or throw a punch or beg for their approval. I just had to succeed where they least expected it. As I sat there, smiling my fake smile and nodding along to whatever meaningless conversation floated around the table, I realized something. Family dinners are a lot like war. You dress up, you show up, you pretend you're there for the good of the group, but deep down, you're all just fighting for survival, trying to come out the least wounded. And tonight, for once, I was winning. At least, that's what I told myself. But something inside me, something small and sharp and mean, whispered that the real fight hadn't even started yet. If you ever want to understand how a person gets chipped down into someone they barely recognize, you have to look at the small moments, not the big ones, because it is never just one blow that breaks you. It is the steady drip, drip, drip of being less than. Year after year, until even you start to believe it. My teenage years were basically one long, slow lesson in second place, and not the kind of second place where you just barely missed winning, but the kind where you were never even in the running to begin with. Ethan was the golden child in every possible way, from the moment he could string a sentence together and flash that grin that made teachers melt and coaches nod approvingly. By the time he was 14, he already had 2 state championship trophies in soccer, a wall full of debate medals, and a spot waiting for him at whatever college he decided was worthy of him. Meanwhile, I was scraping by with C's and the occasional B when the teacher was feeling generous, sitting on the bench during football games, and praying I could get out of high school without tripping over my own shoelaces. It was not that I was dumb, though God knows it felt that way sometimes when Ethan was rattling off answers at the dinner table like a goddamn quiz show contestant. It was more like I just did not fit into the neat little boxes my parents and teachers had set up. I did not have the quick smile or the easy confidence. I was the kid who asked weird questions, who stayed up all night taking apart the toaster to see how it worked, who could get lost in a book about ancient civilizations while the rest of the class was busy pretending to understand Shakespeare. At birthday parties, the difference between us was even clearer. Ethan's parties were these big, noisy affairs with banners and balloons and the whole football team crammed into our backyard, tossing footballs and knocking over snack tables while Mom beamed from the porch like the queen of a very specific kind of kingdom. My birthdays were quieter, smaller, and somehow always a little bit sad, like an afterthought. One year, Mom forgot to buy a cake and tried to cover it up by sticking candles into a store-bought pie, and even though I smiled and pretended it was funny, something inside me cracked a little deeper. Graduations were worse. When Ethan graduated, it was like a goddamn parade. Banners, a barbecue, neighbors dropping by with cards stuffed with $20 bills. When I crossed the stage 2 years later, clutching my diploma like it was a life raft, Mom and Dad clapped politely and then immediately started talking about Ethan's internship offer from some shiny tech firm 3 states away. I was background noise at my own celebration, a footnote in my brother's never-ending highlight reel. Even holidays, the times you are supposed to feel safe and loved and part of something bigger than yourself, turned into landmines of humiliation. Thanksgiving was the worst, because that was when the whole extended family would gather and Ethan would be paraded around like a prized show dog. Aunt Marcy would gush about his latest award, Uncle Rick would slap him on the back and say, "You're making us all proud, son," and then there would be this awful, heavy pause where everyone would glance at me and then just as quickly look away. Like my failure might be contagious. It was not that anyone said anything cruel outright, no one ever told me I was a disappointment to my face, but it was there in the way they rushed past me to get to Ethan, the way they forgot to ask about my life, the way they laughed just a little too hard at the stories about my screw-ups. Like the time I got fired from the movie theater for falling asleep during the midnight shift, or the time I crashed Dad's truck into the mailbox because I was trying to steer with my knee while unwrapping a cheeseburger. Those stories became family folklore, retold and exaggerated until even I started to believe that was all I would ever be, the punchline to a joke I never agreed to be part of. And the worst part, the part that still keeps me up some nights when the house is too quiet and the memories are too loud, is that I tried. God, I tried. I studied until my eyes burned, took on crappy jobs after school, smiled through the shitty comments and the cheap laughs, thinking that maybe if I just worked a little harder, tried a little longer, I could catch up. But no matter how fast I ran, Ethan was always 10 steps ahead, smiling over his shoulder like he barely had to break a sweat. There was one Thanksgiving when I was 17 that sticks in my mind like a splinter. We were all sitting around the table, plates piled high, when Dad raised his glass and said, "Here's to Ethan, showing us what hard work and dedication look like." Everyone clinked glasses and cheered, and I sat there with a mouthful of stuffing I suddenly could not swallow, blinking hard against the sting in my eyes, pretending my heart had not just dropped straight through the floor. That was the night I realized something important. In our family, second place did not get a trophy or a pat on the back. Second place got you scraps. Second place got you silence. Second place got you invisible. I started keeping my dreams to myself after that, started building little secret hopes in the corners where nobody could stomp on them. I figured if no one expected anything from me, then they could not be disappointed when I finally did something worth noticing. But even that plan had holes, because deep down, no matter how much I told myself I didn't care, I wanted them to see me. I wanted them to be proud. I wanted to stop being the family joke. Looking back now, I wonder if that need, that desperate, gnawing hunger for validation, was the thing that drove me harder than anything else. Not ambition, not greed, not even anger, but this sad, stubborn belief that maybe, just maybe, if I built something big enough, if I made enough noise, they would finally turn their heads and see me standing there. But the thing about building your dreams in the dark is that you get real good at hiding them, even from yourself. And by the time I finally had something real to show for it, I was not sure if I even knew how to stop hiding anymore. Second place gets you the scraps. And after a while, you start to believe that is all you deserve. There is a kind of humiliation that does not leave bruises you can show anyone, a slow burn shame that sticks to your skin like sweat in the middle of August, and I carried that feeling all through my early 20s like a second. Heavier heart beating out of rhythm with the world around me. After high school, while Ethan packed up his trophies and scholarship offers and left for a college whose tuition price tag could have funded a small country, I stayed home and bounced between jobs that paid just enough to make me hate myself a little more each month. I worked at a gas station where the fluorescent lights buzzed so loud it felt like I was losing brain cells every second I stood behind the counter. I stocked shelves overnight at a grocery store where nobody even looked you in the eye unless you messed something up. I did temp work in offices where the real employees talked to me like I was a dog learning to fetch, slow and careful, like maybe I would screw it all up if they used too many big words. Every time I clocked out and dragged my ass home, there was this gnawing pit in my stomach that whispered, "This is it. This is all you'll ever be." Mom, bless her passive-aggressive heart, tried to be supportive in the way that makes you want to set your own hair on fire. She would pat my hand across the kitchen table and say things like, "Maybe you're just not meant for big things, honey," her voice soft and syrupy, like she was offering me a warm blanket to curl up and die under. Dad said even less, which somehow felt worse, a big blank silence that screamed louder than any words could have. Family gatherings turned into obstacle courses I could barely navigate without tripping over my own bitterness. Ethan would swing into town twice a year, looking tan and successful, tossing keys to a new car onto the counter like it was no big deal, and Mom would beam at him like he personally invented gravity. Meanwhile, I would stand awkwardly near the snack table, holding a paper plate of lukewarm cheese cubes, waiting for someone, anyone, to ask about my life. They never did, at least not seriously. At best, I would get a quick, "Still working at the gas station?" followed by an even quicker change of subject before I could answer. It was around that time I started to feel something shifting deep inside me, like a steel rod sliding into place where all the soft parts used to be. I stopped looking at my situation like a phase and started looking at it like a battlefield. If they were not going to see me, if they were going to keep stepping over me like I was some kind of broken piece of sidewalk, then fine, I would make something so undeniable they would have no choice but to look. It was not about making them love me anymore. That ship had sailed years ago and was probably rusting at the bottom of the ocean by now. No, it was about forcing them to acknowledge that I existed, that I mattered, that I could build something with these scraped-together pieces of pride and spite and stubbornness they had left me with. If they would not hand me a seat at the table, I would tear the whole goddamn table down and build a new one. I started taking online courses late at night after work, sitting at the same beat-up kitchen table where Mom had once told me maybe I was just not meant for big things. I learned how to code, how to design, how to think like the people who had always seemed so far above me. It was slow, it was frustrating, and more than once I almost threw my laptop through the window, but every time I felt that old voice creeping back, the one that said I was nothing, that I would always be nothing, I thought about Ethan's smirk, about Mom's pitying eyes, about the way Dad's silence weighed heavier than any lecture, and I pushed through it. During the day, I still scrubbed floors or rang up cigarettes and scratch-offs for people who barely glanced at me, but at night, in the glow of my cheap second-hand laptop, I was building something nobody could see yet, but that I knew, deep in my bones, would change everything. Every small win, a completed course, a successful project, a working prototype, felt like stacking bricks onto a wall between me and every sneer, every shrug, every dismissal I had ever swallowed. People love to say that sticks and stones may break your bones, but words will never hurt you, and let me tell you, that is a steaming pile of bullshit. Words sink in deeper than any stone ever could, and the worst ones are not shouted at you by strangers. They are whispered by the people who are supposed to love you most. They are the little comments said with a smile. The doubts slipped under your skin like tiny splinters, too small to pull out but too sharp to forget. The label of loser stuck to me harder than any glue, and even when I started to see real progress, even when small opportunities began to flicker at the edges of my world like fireflies you almost think you imagined, I still carried that label in my chest like a lead weight. Every job interview, every pitch meeting, every late-night coding session was a battle against that voice inside me saying, "Who do you think you are?" But here's the thing about resentment. If you let it fester just right, if you feed it carefully with just the right blend of anger and ambition, it becomes a fire hot enough to forge steel. And I was getting harder by the day. I knew one thing with absolute bone-deep certainty. I was not going to let my story end with a sigh and a shrug. If they would not see me, then fine, I would build something so big, so undeniable, that they would have no choice but to choke on their own underestimation. They could keep their pity and their polite little smiles. I was done trying to earn them. I was building something bigger than their approval. I was building a damn empire out of the ashes they left me. And one day, when it was ready, when the walls were high enough and the foundation solid enough, I would show them. I would make them see me. You do not really notice when your life splits into two separate tracks because it happens so quietly you hardly hear the crack, but looking back, I can tell you exactly when it started for me, those first nights hunched over a beat-up laptop with a cracked screen. The house silent except for the ticking of the old kitchen clock and the low hum of the refrigerator that needed fixing 6 months ago. It started the night I realized that if I kept playing the game the way they wanted me to, the way they expected me to, I was going to lose over and over until there was nothing left of me but the scraps they laughed about over holiday dinners. During the day, I was still the same old Nate everyone thought they knew, dragging myself through whatever job would have me, taking orders from supervisors who talked to me like I had to be reminded which way was up. But at night, when the world finally went quiet and nobody was breathing down my neck, I turned into someone else, someone who built things, who had ideas, who could see a different kind of future flickering at the edge of the darkness. It started small, sketching out rough designs for an app that kept crawling into my mind every time I stood in some fluorescent-lit break room, watching people try and fail to survive their workdays without burning out completely. It sounds simple when you say it out loud, an employee wellness app, but back then, it felt like trying to catch smoke with my bare hands. I had no real training, no fancy degree, no mentors ready to pat me on the back and steer me through the complicated parts. All I had was stubbornness, an internet connection that cut out every time it rained, and a bone-deep rage at the idea that maybe I really was destined to be the family screw-up forever. Failure was not just a possibility back then, it was basically my roommate. I failed so often and so badly that it almost became funny in a sick kind of way. I built the first version of the app and watched it crash before it could even load the homepage. I spent weeks working on a pitch deck only to have the one guy who agreed to hear me out yawn halfway through my presentation and tell me politely that I wasn't really solving a real problem. I sent out email after email to companies and investors, and most of them didn't even bother to answer, the silence hitting harder than any outright rejection could have. Every rejection, every crash, every late-night moment where I stared at the screen and thought about throwing the whole damn laptop through the wall, it all carved something sharper inside me. I stopped daydreaming about being discovered or rescued or praised. I stopped needing anyone to pat me on the head and tell me I was on the right track. I decided, somewhere around the 50th failure, that it did not matter if anyone else saw it yet. I saw it. And that was enough to keep going. There were nights I worked until the sun started bleeding into the horizon, my eyes burning, my hands cramped from hours of typing and retyping and deleting and starting over. There were weekends when I canceled plans, not that there were many to begin with, just so I could stay in and tweak the code or rethink the design one more time. It became an obsession, but the kind of obsession that felt necessary, like breathing, like if I stopped even for a second it would all collapse and I would be trapped back in the life I was clawing my way out of. And then one night, a Wednesday, I remember because I had to be up early for a shift I hated more than root canals, it happened. I checked my inbox, and there it was, a short, curt email from a mid-sized tech company that had somehow stumbled across a demo I had posted in a desperate attempt to get some attention. They liked the idea. They wanted to talk more. Nothing fancy, no promises, no fireworks, just a single thread of possibility dangling in front of me like a lifeline. I sat there staring at the screen for what felt like hours, heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my teeth, because even though it was small and uncertain and probably a long shot, it was something real, something tangible, something that proved maybe, just maybe, all those nights spent building dreams in dark corners had not been a waste after all. Ever had someone underestimate you so badly it made you want to burn down the world just to prove them wrong? Tell me your story. I'm listening. That night, I did not sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the email burned into my brain like a brand, feeling more alive than I had in years. Part of me was terrified because getting close to something you want is sometimes scarier than failing outright, but a bigger part of me, the part that had been quietly sharpening its teeth in the dark, was ready. I was not going to back down this time. I was not going to let fear or doubt or the million small failures behind me pull me under. I was ready to fight for this, to fight for the version of myself nobody else seemed to believe could exist. Because the thing about dreams built in dark corners is that they do not need anyone else's approval to come to life. They just need you to refuse to let them die. You would think after all those years, after all those Thanksgiving snubs, after every birthday forgotten and every graduation half applauded, that I would have been numb to it by now. That I would have learned to build a wall so high and thick that nothing Ethan said could climb over it. You would think that when he leaned back in his chair, carving into his roast beef with a smugness so natural it might as well have been tattooed on his forehead, and said those words, "At least I don't work a dead-end job," that I would have just shrugged it off the way I had done 1,000 times before. But that night was different, because for once, I was not the same Nate they remembered, and even if they did not know it yet, I was sitting there with a loaded gun in my hand, metaphorically speaking, and I was damn well ready to pull the trigger. The words hung there between us, heavy and poisonous, dripping into the mashed potatoes and green bean casserole like some kind of slow-acting venom. Ethan smirked around a mouthful of food, already half turned back to his conversation with Dad about stock portfolios or golf handicaps or whatever it was they thought made them better men. Mom gave a soft little laugh that sounded more like a hiccup, then quickly reached for her wine glass, pretending she had not heard the insult, pretending everything was still just fine, that the family was still intact, not rotting from the inside out. For a heartbeat, I felt the old instincts kick in, the ones that told me to laugh it off, to lower my eyes, to swallow the hurt like a bitter pill and pretend it did not matter, because that was what they expected of me. That was the part one had been cast to play since the day I learned to walk. But then another feeling surged up and over the first, hotter, sharper, more dangerous, and it carried me forward before I could even think twice about it. I smiled, a slow, easy smile that felt alien on my face, like I was borrowing it from someone else, someone stronger, someone who had finally stopped giving a damn about staying small to keep everyone else comfortable. I reached into my jacket pocket, feeling the cheap fabric catch against my knuckles, and pulled out my phone, tapping the screen a few times until the app opened, glowing steady and bright in the dim light of the dining room. I turned the screen toward Ethan, holding it out across the table like a peace offering wrapped around a hand grenade, and waited. At first, he just glanced at it, disinterested, the way you might glance at a menu in a restaurant you hate but agreed to visit to keep the peace. Then he froze, a forkful of beef halfway to his mouth, and leaned closer, squinting as if maybe the glowing icon would rearrange itself into something less terrifying if he just looked hard enough. "You recognize this, right?" I said, keeping my voice light, almost bored, as if we were discussing the weather or some new brand of toothpaste. "You use it every day at work. Your whole department does." Ethan set down his fork with a clatter that made Mom jump and slosh a little wine over the edge of her glass. He stared at the screen like it might start spitting out bullets any second. "Yeah," he said after a long, slow pause, his voice rougher than usual. Sure, it's that new HR thing they made everyone download." "Right," I said, still smiling, still calm, still feeling like I had a secret pumping through my veins instead of blood. "Well, here's the thing, I built it. Sold it to your company last month. $8 million. I wish I could tell you the satisfaction was pure, that it tasted sweet and clean like a long overdue victory, but the truth is it was messy and heavy and complicated, a twisted knot of emotions that hit me harder than I expected." Ethan's face drained of color so fast it was almost funny, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air, his hands clenching and unclenching around the edges of his plate. Mom dropped her napkin and scrambled to pick it up, her hands shaking just slightly, the way they used to when the phone bill came and we did not have enough to cover it. Dad cleared his throat loudly, a sound that used to mean cut it out, boys, but now just hung uselessly in the thick, sticky air between us. Nobody said a word, and for the first time in my entire life, I was not the one shrinking into the silence. I sat there tall and steady, feeling like I was finally standing on solid ground while the rest of them flailed around in quicksand. "You know," I said after a long moment, my voice casual and almost friendly, "HR has a little thing about conflict of interest. Pretty sure you'll be getting a call about it tomorrow morning. Might want to brush up on the company handbook, just saying." Ethan's hands were flat on the table now, pressing so hard his knuckles turned white, and for a second, I thought he might actually flip the whole thing over, Thanksgiving centerpiece and all. But he didn't. He just sat there, his mouth working soundlessly, his eyes darting to Mom, to Dad, to Kelly sitting frozen beside him, then back to me, full of a kind of stunned horror that no trophy, no promotion, no shiny new car could hide. It would have been easy to feel sorry for him in that moment, to let the old guilt rise up and pull me back into the role of the lesser brother, the peacemaker, the screw-up desperate for forgiveness. But I did not feel sorry. Not even a little. Because this was not just about one dinner, one comment, one jab across a plate of overcooked meat. This was about a lifetime of being small so he could feel big, of laughing off insults that carved deep and sharp into places I had never even let myself acknowledge until now. This was about every time I had sat in this very room, drowning under the weight of invisible expectations I could never meet, while he floated effortlessly above it all, celebrated for breathing the right way while I fought just to be seen. This was about reclaiming something I had been taught I did not deserve: respect, dignity, a place at the goddamn table. The room stayed frozen like that for what felt like forever, each second stretching out longer and thinner until it threatened to snap. Finally, Mom made a feeble attempt to pivot, muttering something about dessert, about how she had baked a pie. Would not we all like some pie? But the words fell flat and useless in the heavy, electrified air. I leaned back in my chair, sipping my water with deliberate slowness, and let the silence do my talking for me. Because sometimes the loudest thing you can say is nothing at all, just standing your ground and daring the world to move first. The match had been struck. The fire was coming. There are moments in life when time seems to peel itself open like a wound, stretching out longer than it should, making every sound sharper, every glance heavier, until you feel like you are drowning in the thickness of it. That night, after I dropped the bomb about the app and the $8 million, the dinner table became that kind of moment, suspended, brittle, charged like the air before a thunderstorm is going to split the sky in two. Ethan sat frozen, fork dangling uselessly between his fingers, his mouth a tight, bloodless line like he had swallowed something sour and could not figure out how to spit it out without making a bigger mess. His shoulders, always squared back with that easy, effortless arrogance he wore so naturally, were hunched now, drawn in tight like he was trying to physically shrink away from what was happening. For the first time in my entire life, he looked small. And God help me, part of me wanted to savor it, to lean back in my chair, cross my arms, and watch him squirm until he cracked wide open. My parents sat like statues at either end of the table, their faces stiff with confusion and disbelief, like someone had suddenly started speaking a language they did not understand. My mom's wine glass was still suspended halfway between the table and her mouth, forgotten, the red liquid trembling against the rim with the slight shaking of her hand. My dad, who normally found a way to bluster through awkward moments with a grunt or a barked-out joke, just stared at me like he was seeing a stranger for the first time. The silence stretched on, longer and longer, until it began to creak under its own weight, and still, nobody moved. I let it sit there, heavy and uncomfortable, because I knew, finally, they could not ignore me. They could not pat my head, ruffle my hair, and steer the conversation back to safer waters. There was no steering around this. They were going to have to sit in the wreckage they had built. "You sold it to his company?" Dad finally asked, his voice rough and disbelieving, like the words themselves tasted bad in his mouth. His hand gripped the edge of the table like he needed the support, like he was afraid the world might actually tilt sideways if he let go. "Yep," I said, keeping my voice light and easy, like I was commenting on the weather or the score of the game. $8 million. Couple more if the rollout goes well over the next year. Ethan made a small, strangled sound deep in his throat, the kind of sound you make when you stub your toe in the dark but cannot yell because you do not want to wake the whole house. He set his fork down carefully, precisely, like he was afraid sudden movements might trigger something he could not control. His eyes were locked on me now, burning with a mixture of disbelief, rage, and something else, something colder, something that looked a hell of a lot like fear. "You're lying," he said, but the words were weak, thin, unraveling even as they left his mouth. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the table, the phone still glowing softly in my hand. I pulled up the article, a press release from his own company, proudly announcing the acquisition of a small but promising tech startup specializing in employee wellness solutions. There was my name, plain as day, tucked into the last paragraph like an afterthought, but it was there. I slid the phone across the table to him without saying another word. He picked it up with shaking fingers, his eyes scanning the screen, and I watched the moment it hit him, the moment the truth slammed into his chest like a freight train. His face went pale, then gray, like someone had drained all the blood out of him and left only the shell behind. Mom set her glass down with a soft clink and folded her hands neatly in her lap, staring at the tablecloth as if willing herself to disappear into it. Dad shifted in his chair, cleared his throat again, but whatever words he wanted to say died before they reached his mouth. They looked at me like they were seeing something monstrous, something unfamiliar and dangerous they did not know how to handle. Maybe they expected me to laugh it off, to tell them it was a joke, that I had not really outplayed them all while they were too busy ignoring me to notice. Maybe they thought I would crumble under the weight of the attention now that I finally had it. But I just sat there, calm, steady, anchored in the knowledge that I had done what I said I would do. I had made them see me. "You didn't think someone like me could pull it off, huh?" I said, my voice low and almost kind, the way you would talk to a dog that just bit your hand out of fear. "You figured I'd be stuck working nights forever, mopping floors and selling scratch tickets. You never thought maybe I was building something while you weren't looking." The anger in Ethan's face twisted, tightened, but he stayed silent, grinding his teeth so hard I could hear it over the soft whir of the ceiling fan. It was not just anger at me, it was anger at himself, at the world, at the realization that no matter how many trophies he stacked up, no matter how many raises he snagged or how many awards he lined his shelves with, he had missed the one thing he should have seen coming. I had outgrown them all. I had built something bigger than their expectations, bigger than their labels, bigger than the tiny little box they had shoved me into when I was a kid and too desperate for approval to fight back. And now there was nothing they could do but sit there and choke on it. Dad finally pushed his chair back with a loud scrape against the tile floor, standing up stiffly like an old man suddenly made older. "I think," he said, his voice breaking on the edges, "I think I need some air." He walked out of the room without looking at anyone, his heavy boots thudding against the worn hardwood floor, and a moment later we heard the front door swing open and slam shut, rattling the windows in their frames. Mom stood up too, her movements mechanical, gathering the dirty plates with hands that moved too fast, too frantic, the way you do when you're trying to pretend you can clean away a mess too big for soap and water to touch. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at Ethan. She just loaded her arms with dishes and fled to the kitchen, leaving Ethan and me alone in the ruins. For a long time, neither of us said a word. We just sat there, staring at the wreckage of what used to be, the charred remains of a family dinner that had gone so far off the rails it might never find its way back. Finally, Ethan stood, slow and stiff, like he had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. He didn't look at me as he turned and walked out of the room, leaving me sitting there at the table, the flickering candlelight making shadows dance across the torn expressions left in his wake. 8 million reasons to shut up. 8 million reasons to stop pretending I was less. And for the first time in my life, 8 million reasons that said, louder than any words ever could, that I had won. You would think that after everything, after all the years of swallowing bitterness like it was my morning coffee, after every birthday I spent plastering on a fake smile while Ethan soaked up every ounce of attention, after every Thanksgiving where my accomplishments were treated like side dishes nobody asked for, you would think finally winning would feel like standing on top of the world, breathing clean, sharp air, looking down at all the people who doubted you and laughing straight into the wind. You would think that sitting at that table, with the heavy silence suffocating Ethan and my parents scattered like broken chess pieces, would have tasted like the sweetest revenge anyone could ever dream of. But the truth, the ugly and twisted truth, is that winning did not feel anything like that. It felt hollow. It felt cold. 2 days after the dinner that blew up whatever thin threads were holding our family together, I heard from a friend who still worked in the corporate machine where Ethan had built his precious little kingdom. Word was getting around fast, whispering through the cubicles and offices like wildfire, that HR had flagged Ethan's connection to the newly acquired app and pulled him into a meeting that very morning. Conflict of interest, they called it. Ethics violation. Terms of employment breach. Phrases that sounded official and bloodless, but could carve a career apart faster than a wrecking ball through drywall. They put him on administrative leave pending further investigation, which was just a polite way of saying they were gathering the paperwork to make sure they would not get sued when they pushed him out the door. No one came right out and said it, but everyone knew how these things worked. Ethan's career, the shining, bulletproof career that had been the crown jewel of every family conversation for the past 15 years, was circling the drain, and there was not a damn thing he could do to stop it. When I first heard the news, standing in the middle of my tiny apartment that still smelled faintly of cheap takeout and overworked electronics, I thought maybe I would feel that surge of triumph I had been chasing for years. I thought maybe I would throw my arms up and laugh, maybe pour myself a drink and toast to my own finally acknowledged genius. But I just stood there, phone still buzzing uselessly in my hand, staring at nothing, feeling like someone had scooped everything out of me and left me standing hollow and weightless. I should have felt amazing. I should have felt invincible. Instead, I felt like I had punched myself in the gut and was too stupid to realize it until the pain caught up. That night, I lay awake staring at the cracked ceiling, listening to the neighbors stomping around upstairs, the cheap radiator clanking and hissing like it was angry too, and I thought about Ethan. I thought about how many times he had made me feel small, how many times he had laughed at my expense, how many times he had basked in the golden glow of being the one everyone admired while I shuffled along in a shadow, trying and failing to find my own light. I thought about how easy it had been for him to dismiss me, how effortless it had been for him to deliver that final little jab across the dinner table without a second thought, without any real malice even. Just because that was the way the world had always worked for him. He did not have to try to crush me because the world had already taught him that I would never be a threat. And I thought about how I had spent years sharpening myself into something deadly, something they could not ignore, something that could hurt if they got too close, and how, when the moment came, I had not hesitated to use it. Somewhere between 3 and 4 in the morning, when the sky outside was still dark and the world felt like it belonged only to ghosts and regrets, I realized something that made my stomach twist. I had won. But the person I had beaten was not the enemy I had built up in my head all these years. Ethan had been a jerk, sure, and an arrogant bastard most of the time, but he was also just a product of the same broken machinery that had tried to grind me into dust. He was not some villain plotting my downfall behind closed doors. He was just a guy who had been handed the bigger slice of the pie and never thought to ask why. And me? I had spent so long dreaming of revenge that I had not stopped to ask myself what it would cost. I had not thought about what it would feel like to see him stumble, to see that unshakable confidence crack, to see the person everyone else had worshipped start to crumble, and to realize I did not feel bigger or stronger or more whole. I just felt tired, and more alone than I had ever felt in my life. Guilt started creeping in like a slow, cold tide, soaking into everything, making even the victory feel like something rotten and crumbling. I wondered if I had gone too far. I wondered if there had been another way, a way to win without destroying him, without burning down everything between us until there was nothing left but ash and silence. But deep down, I knew the answer. There had never been another way, not really. This had been set in motion years ago, with every slight, every dismissal, every smirk tossed my way like a bone to a starving dog. I had built this moment out of a lifetime of second-place finishes and swallowed pride, and once you build something like that, you do not get to pretend you are surprised when it comes crashing down. Still, knowing it did not make it feel any better. I won. I proved them all wrong. I carved out a place for myself with blood and grit and stubbornness when nobody else believed I could. And yet, lying there in the dark, listening to the radiator hiss and the world outside spin on without noticing, I could not shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, I had lost something too. Something bigger. Something I might never get back. There are victories that shine, that feel like standing on a mountaintop with the sun blazing against your skin and the wind singing your name, and then there are victories like mine, victories that taste like ash in your mouth. Victories that leave you standing alone in the ruins of everything you once thought you wanted. After everything, after the $8 million and the stunned silence at that dinner table, after Ethan's career started to crumble under the weight of an investigation he could not outrun, I should have felt like a king surveying the kingdom he fought so hard to claim. Instead, all I felt was tired and hollow and so damned alone it hurt to breathe sometimes. In the weeks that followed the dinner, the distance between me and my parents grew so wide it felt like a canyon, too deep and too dark to ever bridge again. They stopped calling, stopped checking in, their absence almost louder than their presence had ever been. When we did talk, the conversations were strained and brittle, full of awkward silences and false starts, like they were talking to a stranger they did not know how to love anymore. I could hear the shame in their voices, the quiet mourning for the neat little version of our family they had clung to for so long, the version where Ethan was the shining sun and I was the cautionary tale tucked away in the background. Mom tried, in her way, to patch things over, leaving messages that danced around the real subject like a drunk trying to tiptoe across a minefield, asking about the weather, about my health, never about the app, never about the money, never about the thing that now hung between us like a loaded gun on the coffee table. Dad barely spoke at all, and when he did, it was stiff and formal, as if he were speaking to a neighbor he barely tolerated, not the son he had once bounced on his knee while promising the world was ours for the taking. And Ethan, God, Ethan spiraled faster than I think even he expected. Stripped of the job that had defined him, he flailed, trying to build something new out of the wreckage, but nothing stuck. His marriage started to crack too, the strain showing in every forced smile and too bright family photo posted online, like a desperate prayer for normalcy. Rumors started swirling about him drinking too much, about bar fights and angry late-night phone calls, about a man who had been so sure of his own story that he had no idea how to live without it. I watched it all from a distance, my $8 million sitting quietly in the bank, untouched except for the occasional splurge on things that did not bring half as much satisfaction as I thought they would. I moved into a better apartment, bought a car that actually started without a prayer and a kick, but none of it filled the hollow space inside me, the space where I had once stored all my anger, all my resentment, all my desperate need to be seen and validated. It turned out that once you tore down the wall that kept everyone else out, you were the one left standing alone in the rubble, with nothing but your own doubts for company. I started asking myself questions I was not ready to answer. Had I become the very thing I hated? Had I spent so long fighting to be something more that I had lost sight of who I was supposed to be? Was this what justice looked like? A ruined family, a broken brother, a hollow man sitting on a pile of money that could not buy back a single moment of peace? Late at night, lying awake in my too large bed, I would replay that dinner over and over in my mind. The way Ethan's face crumpled when he realized he had lost. The way my parents looked at me like I had become a stranger overnight. I told myself it was worth it, that they deserved it, that I had only ever wanted them to see me for who I really was. But the truth was uglier, messier, harder to swallow. The truth was, I had wanted to hurt them. I had wanted them to hurt the way I had hurt for so many years, to feel small and invisible and unworthy, to sit in the same misery I had lived with while they celebrated Ethan's every minor achievement like it was the second coming. And I had gotten what I wanted, every last drop of it. I had torn down the pedestal they had built for him and left them all standing in the dust. But standing there alone, with everything I had ever claimed to want finally in my grasp, all I could feel was this gnawing, aching emptiness, a loneliness so sharp it felt like a knife buried deep in my ribs. Because revenge, it turns out, is a bitter meal, and it does not fill you up, it just leaves you hungrier, emptier, aching for something you cannot name because it died a long time ago, buried under years of resentment and missed chances and words left unsaid. I still wonder, even now, if it was justice or just cruelty disguised as victory. I wonder if there had been another road I could have taken, one that led to healing instead of destruction, to forgiveness instead of fire. I wonder if there is a version of this story where we all walked away with something more than broken pieces in our hands. But wondering does not change what happened. It does not bring back the brother who used to build forts with me in the backyard before life taught us to measure our worth in trophies and paychecks. It does not bring back the parents who used to tuck me in at night, whispering that I could be anything I wanted if I just believed hard enough. It does not change the way the silence feels heavier now than any words ever could have. I won. I finally made them see me. And somewhere along the way, I lost something far more important. If revenge costs you your peace, was it really worth it?